All right, so I want to welcome you guys to our final week of the history of sports media. Our GTT, that's what I'm calling it these days, is go-to training, kind of like GTL, but better, GTT. So I'm glad you guys could join us for our last GTT session. I hope you guys have been enjoying the course. I know this week the assignment is kind of could be time consuming. We're going to talk about it at the end though, so you guys make sure you save your questions for the assignment, and we'll discuss it and make sure everybody understands the assignment completely and is on the same page. But Justin had reminded me that tonight is football, so I know that everybody has a big weekend coming up. I'm actually going to be out of town this weekend. I leave tonight at 8 o'clock, and I'm not back until next Wednesday. But I will be checking email while I'm away. I'll also be working some while I'm away, including getting your papers graded. I'm hoping to have your paper that you submitted this week done by the time I land tonight, and then get them entered as soon as possible tomorrow. So if you have any questions once you get those grades, please let me know. And then also, if you have any outstanding assignments, please don't think you can't turn them in. Let's get them taken care of so we can make sure that you pass the class. I hate to see you not pass the class because of a missing assignment. Right, exactly, Justin. Something is better than nothing. So when you get a 0 for 15% of your grade, that's a lot worse than if you get a 60 for 15% of your grade. So just get something in because I would hate to see you miss passing the class by just a couple of points because you didn't turn in another assignment. So please go back and look at your activities and reach out to me if there's anything that you have any questions on. So, all right. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to be reading a lot from you, or a lot to you today. This is our kind of our story time session to give you guys some better idea of what it's like, the writing style from back in the early sports coverage. And I will be reading out of this book. It's backwards though, isn't it? um, let's see. I don't know how to show it to you right side because I'm looking at a mirror image of myself, but hopefully you can see this and read it backwards. It's called The Best American Sports Writing of the Century. You can get it in the library if you want it for reference. It might be a little bit too late to get it for this assignment, but they also might have it out in an ebook form. I'm not sure. So I'll be sharing with you some readings from this. It's not just relegated to this time period that we're talking about though, so you might want to check it out later just to do some other reading. What they do is it's a compilation of the best sports writing over the years, and it includes recent stuff too. It's not just old school stuff. It's comes all the way up to there's some from 2000, but it's a little bit older, but through the 90s definitely. But if you want to check it out. Yeah, Justin, you're right. It's more prevalent because of the way they had to craft the stories, but also it's harder to find the examples from the beginning because of the copyrights and stuff like that, and because the stories are so old that it's kind of hard to find those references. So I'm going to turn my camera off and turn the keynote on, and we'll go ahead and get started with our materials. Okay, so we are talking this week about early sports coverage, and by the end of the week, this is what you'll be able to do. This week's assignments are based on storytelling and how the story can be told. That seems to be an underlying theme in this class, so hopefully by now you've figured out that the same story can be told multiple different ways, and that's kind of what the idea behind this assignment this week is. So we'll talk about that at the end of the session. Before we get started, want to see if you guys remember why we want to capture the notion, or why the notion of capturing the moment is so important. What does the moment do for us? Yes, Justin. Yep, and Jamie, correct. It creates memories and engages the fans, and that's what sports is all about, right? Without us and without these memories, sports wouldn't be what it is today. Yeah, it definitely sticks in your mind, Bennett, and it goes a long way with you. I mean, I think, was it you last week who was saying that you were there for at Dolphin Stadium when something big happens? I can't remember what it was, but maybe the undefeated season. Anyway, so yeah, these are things that can stay with you forever. You have all these memories. No matter how old you get, you still remember that time when you were watching your favorite team live. Yes, the undefeated season. That's what I thought it was. So clearly a moment that is still connected with people because nobody's been able to top that yet. But so we're looking at early sports coverage and the birth of sports coverage. Just real quick, the history of sports coverage is long and extensive, but I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version of it. In the 1800s is when we really started seeing sports as a diversion come about. By the 1870s is when coverage of sports started emerging in the paper. And then by the 1890s is when we had the first dedicated sports section for a paper, which was the New York World. Now, if you guys remember from last week, we were talking about the Sporting News. Well, the Sporting News was from this era too, but it ended up focusing and mainly being a baseball publication. So about this time is when sports really started being seen as a diversion, and people really started getting into sports. And Justin, you mentioned the writing style and having to craft a story and tell a story, and that's exactly right. Is these old sports writers, you had to describe more than just the game and what was going on the television. Or not the television, see? There was no television. Yeah, and that's a great example, especially with I'm assuming that you've had the opportunity to do the discussion post this week on the Four Horsemen of Notre Dame. The reason that is such a famous article and story is because of the way Grantland Rice tells the story. He compares tackling the Irish to tackling a cyclone. He compares their running backs to the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. He's doing a lot of comparing and analogies with military stuff because he's tying in the army and the battle of the game. But if you look at that article, it says a lot. It's a lot of words, and it tells a really great story. But when it comes down to the game, you probably don't remember much about what happened in the game from what the story told you, except that Army lost. But Grantland said that they had a great fight. So, and he really liked turning people into heroes in his writing. So he's a really great example of a sports writer whose writing has really withstood the test of time. There's another one that you can find for him. If you Google Secretariat War Admiral Grantland Rice, one will pop up. That's a really great example about that race. And he gives Seabiscuit, I'm sorry, did I say Secretariat? I meant Seabiscuit. He gives Seabiscuit a voice. You know, he gives the horses he makes the horses talk to each other in the article, kind of like, okay, in horse language, he looked over and said, "Are you ready to pick this up?" So it's they weren't just concerned with what happened in the game. They were concerned with the atmosphere, what the crowd was feeling, the weather, whether or not the wind was blowing from center field. You know, you really had to paint that picture with the words. Yeah, Jamie, that's exactly right. Like, there was no television, there was no picture. So they really had to paint that picture for you with those words, and they had to be super descriptive. And obviously, you know, most people didn't even have the opportunity to go to a game. So you didn't even have a reference point. So they really had to be descriptive in the way they told the story. There's a handful of guys who we're going to talk about today who has, you know, their writing style has really withstood the test of time. And a lot of these guys, they weren't just sports writers, they were political writers, or they were other writers. Yeah, it is. I mean, it's something to focus on. It's a more complete story. Justin, I like what you're saying about you know, being liberal with those similes and adjectives and metaphors and stuff. Yeah, you know, you really had to think outside the box. And like, one that sticks out in my mind, that Grantland Rice uses in the Seabiscuit War Admiral thing was like, he said Seabiscuit was like a fat poodle chasing a meat wagon. You know, and so just the way that you describe things is, it affects, you know, the visual that the reader gets, and those are so important when you didn't have pictures, or moving pictures. I guess there was photography, but there wasn't anything else. So um, have you guys had the opportunity to watch the Bill Buckhalter videos yet this week? Yeah, so Bill talks a little bit about that, and I like Bill's videos because he looks at how things kind of have come full circle, and he talks about the changes that writing has gone through the years. And so that's one thing he was talking about is, you know, the galloping ghost, you know, those things that are so distinguished and have withstood the test of time that you recognize, but you know, maybe you don't know where they come from, but it comes from this writing. A lot of these guys, you know, like I was saying, focused on other stuff like political writing. They would write books, they would write screenplays, so it wasn't just sports writing. These guys really were renaissance men when it came to that. So let's think about what you would see in the paper back then. What kind of sports coverage would you see? Well, you'd see some baseball, boxing, football, yeah, mostly college football. Um, the Olympics, track and field, golf. Yeah, Justin, you're on the right track. Tennis, horse racing, um, oh, billiards, bowling, auto racing, dog racing. So kind of, you know, those more kind of lifestyle sports too that the everyday person participated in. Um, yeah, you'd be surprised. Also, another really big popular topic back then was rowing, because it's such an old sport, and so there's a lot of articles about rowing from that era too. Now, when you look at the athletes, who the athletes were, um, they were different from the people who are watching, um, watching them play, right? They were not rich. Many of them had other jobs. They were uneducated. Have you seen the movie Eight Men Out at all? Yeah, Justin, you're exactly right. They were devoted, but they had to survive, and that's kind of the story behind Eight Men Out is the Black Sox, the World Series that they threw, and it talks about why they threw the World Series. It's a really great movie if you have the opportunity to watch it. We're gonna watch it in class today. But these guys they couldn't afford, and Kaminsky was so cheap, and that they didn't really have a choice but to throw the game because they weren't paying him, or he wasn't paying them like he had promised. So they kind of took it into their own hands. And in that time when the mob was so popular and prevalent back then, they really that's why they turned to them, because they didn't have the money. There was also a different relationship that the athletes had with the fans. So that was another interesting thing to look at. What is Leatherheads? Yes, Bennett. Great example. Is Leatherheads a football movie? Yes. Okay. I haven't seen it. I need to add that to my list, I guess. Um, so when you look at the athletes and then look at the audience and who was listening or who was watching the games and reading the games about the games and stuff, they were more educated than the athletes were. But there was also a big, strong kind of middle class or people who could relate to the athletes who were also fans. And those are the ones, who had the cheaper seats or whatever. But as far as newspaper goes, you really had to be educated to understand kind of what they were saying in these articles. And you had to focus on um, the similes and adjectives and words that they were using so you could understand the comparisons they were making and get the full picture of the story. But you also have to remember that back then there weren't as many distractions as we have now, so it was a lot easier to focus on something like that. I want to share with you guys a few examples. You have the Grantland Rice example, and I want to share a few more just to give you an idea of what other articles were like. And I want to share this stuff with you because in Bill Buckhalter's video, he says he started out by emulating others' writings. Well, that's what the assignment is this week, right? Emulating other people's writing. So the more examples you have, the better off you'll be. This article, The Olympic Army, is written in 1936 by a guy named Westbrook Pegler. Pegler was known for his criticism of kind of government. He wasn't just a sports guy; he was another, a political kind of writer too. He would criticize um, presidents and people like that. And so he was sent to cover the Winter Olympics in 1936, which were going on in Germany. Well, what was going on in the world in 1936? Yeah, we were gearing up. We weren't quite there yet, Justin, but we were getting there. And we were just starting to learn who Hitler was. And so Pegler was sent to cover these games, and because of his kind of disdain and he was constantly questioning people. He had the foresight to recognize that it wasn't about the Olympics. This was about something else. So I want to read this to you. Another reason I like to do this is because this, to me, does a really great job of setting the stage, um, as far as being able to see the imagery, but it takes a little bit longer to hook you in. Um, so listen to this and tell me what you think. You got to listen closely, though, so see if you can see the picture in your head. Garmisch-Partenkirchen. Everything is said to happen for the best, and whatever anyone may think of the sporting propriety of our taking part in the political, military, and sporting activities here in Garmisch, the experience should show a net profit to the United States. Such shoving around as the populace received at the hands of the young, strong-armed squad of Hitler bodyguards, appropriately though ingeniously named the Black Guards, was never seen in the United States, even in the heyday of Jimmy Walker or Huey P. Long. American athletes and the journalists of all nations sent to cover the program of sports known as the Winter Olympics saw a perfect demonstration of military dictatorship. And there were those among the throng who agreed that if this is what Huey was promoting in Louisiana, they would be glad to have none of the same. The dictator held 10,000 people in the grandstand of the rink where the figure skating took place until he was ready to take his leave, and before the event they paved his way with such idolatrous care that it made no difference whether anyone else reached the scene or not. Thousands of people were herded this way and that and in the snow who had bought tickets or were trying to buy tickets to see the sport, and thousands were shunted off and away from the enclosure by long cordons of officious, beefy young Nazis in various uniforms, whose only duty was to flatter and accommodate the house painter who became the head man of the Third Reich. It was a magnificent display of strong arm authority, wholly corroborating the old tradition that the German people's favorite sport is to be shoved around by men in uniform. The road approaching the stadium was held clear by a double cordon of troops in brown uniforms who were supposed to not be soldiers but a civilian labor corps, although they dressed like soldiers with the swastika worn on the left arm and performed military drill with shovels instead of guns. At the head of the line near the Stadium of the Black Guards took their stand. They are a special corps, like the King's Life Guard in England, except they are all young, athletic, tall, and of overbearing demeanor. They wear fine black uniforms which flatter the youthful figure of a man, and wear on the left sleeve in silver embroidery the name Adolf Hitler. They were wearing black tin hats, and the very atmosphere was vibrant with oppression and a sense of the importance of the leader. Your correspondent has seen in his time such men as Edison, Ford, Shaw, Einstein, Mussolini, Clemenceau, and Eugene Debs, and therefore might have been a trifle slow to take spark. It seemed a secondary experience, not to say an anticlimax, to witness Adolf Hitler, but to the German government, which had invited the athletes of the world to Garmisch in the name of sport and human brotherhood, it was a tremendous affair. The Olympics were of secondary importance, if any. This was the dictator's day, and it is a good thing for the Americans present that this was so, because they have nothing important to learn from the athletes, but much to learn about the absolute authority in government. You must picture this town. 10,000 swastikas stir faintly in the light winter wind along the streets of Garmisch-Partenkirchen. The flag is the color of blood, with a white circle containing an ancient device in black. The swastika flies from every house and store, and some homes are adorned with long ribbons of little pennants strung together from window to window, 50 or 100 swastikas in a row. Soldiers are everywhere in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, where the athletes of many nations are competing on ice and snow in the brotherhood of sports. There are soldiers in the old German field gray, soldiers of the Labor Corps in brown, and special soldiers of the Black Guard in black and silver. All of the soldiers wear the swastika, and it is seen again on the red post office trucks and the army transports which go tearing through the streets off into the mysterious mountains, splashing melted slush onto the narrow footway. This motor transport gives a strange suggestion of war in the little mountain resort where sportsmen are drawn together in the demonstration of friendship. When the United States held the Winter Olympics at Lake Placid, the only armed force in sight was a small detachment of New York State Police and with service pistols and cartridge belts, and they were there only to regulate motor traffic. I do not know why there are so many troops and so much army transport in Garmisch, and I hesitate to inquire unless that be construed as an effort to obtain military information. I was not interested in military affairs, but only in sport and the great international Olympic ideal of amity through chivalrous competition. I know the ideal by heart, having heard it many times in speeches and read it in statements by Mr. Avery Brundage. the president of the American Athletic Union, who brought the American team over to this armed camp, and by other idealists of the Olympic organization who joined Mr. Brundage in the enjoyment of the official courtesies and flattery delivered in the elegant style of the old world. We ought to treat Mr. Brundage's vanity better at home. Perhaps an official dinner at the White House would equalize some of the honor which the Germans have shown him in their campaign to overpower disgust in America and procure the participation of American athletes. The big army trucks which whir up the hills are painted in camouflage and loaded with soldiers. The little officers' cars built on the design of the old-fashioned low-neck hack are camouflaged too. And the scene is strongly reminiscent of the zone behind the front when the divisions were being rushed to the sector of the next offensive. Up to this time, no artillery has been seen. I take it that the Brotherhood Games of the Winter Olympics, run under the auspices of Nazi sportsmanship, are only infantry action up to this writing. They may be saving their heavy stuff, their tanks and bombers, for the summer program. Well, I'm glad I was here for this particular day, and I insist that as matters turned out, it was a good thing to send an American team. If they didn't learn their lesson this time, they are beyond teaching. At home, we have never found it necessary to mobilize an army for a sport event, and even Huey himself, when he went on tour with his football team, carried on only a few selected gunmen whose function was strictly retributive in the end. So what do you guys think of that? Could you see the village based on the imagery that Pegler used in his writing? Yeah, the fact that he was able to recognize that he was there to cover the Olympics, but guess what? This was not about the Olympics at all. Yeah, Justin, I mean, that's exactly right. This was not written for a sports person, right? This was written for someone who was more interested in kind of the political going on in the world, and they just kind of happened to be using sports because it happened at the Olympics. So it's a good example of showing you that a sports story isn't just about sports. Pegler was able to recognize kind of what they were doing there and why Hitler was putting on such a big show for the journalists of all nations, as well as the athletes. So that one also, it took a little time to get into it, but he sets the scene when he says, he just flat out says it, you must picture this town. And then he goes into the descriptions of the swastikas and the army transport trucks and things like that. So he just sets off the story by, saying, okay, listen up, I'm going to tell you what this place looked like, so make sure you're paying attention. So that's just one example. There's another example from the same time period. It's called a couple years later. So Hitler was still around, and this was it's called Lewis Knocks Out Schmeling. Joe Louis and Max Schmeling fought. They fought in 1936, and they fought another time too. This in 1938. So Bob Considine wrote an article about this boxing match. It's kind of funny how Bob Considine got into sports writing. He went down to the Washington Post to complain that they had spelled his name wrong in an article about tennis, and they said, fine, well, why don't you just start covering it yourself? So that's how Bob Considine got his start. He also wrote 30 Seconds Over Tokyo and some other stuff, but he was also very critical of some folks. So here is his article called Lewis Knocked Out Schmeling, and I think you'll like this one a lot more. I've noticed that in this assignment, it's sometimes easier to create that imagery or that suspense in a story that has to do with boxing or horse racing or something that's a little bit more exciting than football, which we saw Grantland Rice do. So This is called Lewis Knocks Out Schmeling from 1938. Listen to this, buddy, for it comes from a guy whose palms are still wet, whose throat is still dry, and whose jaw is still agape from the utter shock of watching Joe Louis knock out Max Schmeling. It was a shocking thing, that knockout. Short, sharp, merciless, complete. Louis was like this. He was a big, lean copper spring, tightened and retightened through weeks of training until he was one pregnant package of coiled venom. Schmeling hit that spring. He hit it with a whistling right-hand punch in the first minute of the fight, and the spring, tormented with tension, suddenly burst with one brazen spang of activity. Hard brown arms propelling two unerring fists blurred beneath the hot white candelabra of the ring lights. And Schmeling was in the path of them, a man caught and mangled in the whirring claws of a mad and feverish machine. The mob, biggest and most prosperous ever to see a fight in a ball yard, knew that there was the end before the thing had really started. It knew, so it stood up and howled one long shriek. People who had paid as much as $100 for their chairs didn't use them except perhaps to stand on, the better to let the sight burn forever in their memories. There were 4 steps to Schmeling's knockout. A few seconds after he landed his only punch of the fight, Lewis caught him with a lethal little left hook that drove him to the rope so that his right arm was hooked over the top strand like a drunk hanging to a fence. Lewis swarmed over him and hit him with everything he had until referee Donovan pushed him away and counted 1. Schmeling staggered away from the ropes, dazed and sick. He looked drunkenly towards his corner, and before he had turned his head back, Lewis was on him again, first with that left and then that awe-provoking right that made a crunching sound when it hit the German's jaw. Max fell down, hurt and giddy, for a count of 3. He clawed his way up as if the night air were as thick as black water, and Lewis, his nostrils like the mouth of a double-barrel shotgun, took a quiet lead and let him have both barrels. Max fell almost lightly, bereft of his senses, his fingers touching the canvas like a comical stewbum doing his morning exercises, knees bent and his tongue lolling in his head. He got up long enough to be knocked down again, and this time with his dark, unshaven face pushed in the sharp gravel of the resin. Lewis jumped away lightly, a bright and pleased look in his eye, and as he did, the white towel of surrender, which Lewis's handlers had refused to use 2 years ago tonight, came sailing into the ring in a soggy mess. It was thrown by Max Macon, oblivious to the fact that fights cannot end this way in New York. The referee snatched it off the floor and flung it backwards. It hit the ropes and hung there, limp as Schmeling. Donovan counted up to 5 over Max, sensed the futility of it all, and stopped the fight. The big crowd began to rustle restlessly towards the exits, many only now accepting Lewis as champion of the world. There were no eyes for Schmeling, sprawled on his stool in his corner. He got up eventually, his dirty gray and black robe over his shoulders, and wormed through the happy little crowd and hovered around Lewis. And he put his arm around the Negro and smiled. They both smiled and could afford to, for Lewis had made around $200,000 a minute and Schmeling $100,000 a minute. But once he crawled down the belly of the big stadium, Schmeling realized the implications of his defeat. He, who'd won the title on a partly phony foul and beat Lewis 2 years ago with the aid of a crushing punch after the bell had sounded, now said Lewis had fouled him. That would read better in Germany, whence earlier in the day had come a cable from Hitler calling on him to win. It was a low, sneaking trick, but a rather typical last word from Schmeling. So what do you think about that one? Yeah, and Bennett also, here you had Joe Louis, an African American boxer who is going up a big, against the German who is Adolf Hitler's guy. And so this is an example of, this was a sports story, but it had some politics kind of thrown in there at the end, and mentioning Hitler and kind of the pressure that Schmeling was under from him politically, to win. What kind of imagery in that article or stories or adjectives stuck out at you? Josh, do you have can you think of any examples? Can any of you guys think of any examples? Yeah, the towel of surrender. Oh, I was asking with the Lewis Knockshot smelling if you had any examples of the imagery that stuck out at you. My favorite one is that's interesting, Justin, because for me, I one that really stuck out with for me was he was a big lean copper spring tightened and retightened through weeks of training until he was one pregnant package of coiled venom. I don't know what a pregnant package of coiled venom is, but it sounds really fierce. So I'd imagine that after all his training, he's ready to go for it. He's ready to kill. Um, there was another one where he said Lewis caught him with a lethal little left hook that drove him into the rope so that his right arm was hooked over the top strand like drunk, like a drunk hanging to a fence. So he's kind of staggered over and he's barely holding on, and we all know kind of what that image is in our head. There was another one where he says, his nostrils like the mouth of a double barrel shotgun. He clawed his way up as if the night air were thick as black water. There's another area where he says, his fingers touching the canvas like a comical stew bum doing his morning exercises, knees bent and the tongue lolling in his head. That when I read that, I think of Goofy. In those workout cartoons they had a long time ago. You know, I could see kind of the silliness in the way the guy is doing push-ups. So this to me, and also, from the very beginning, he says, listen to this. I was there. My palms are still wet. I lost my voice because it was so exciting. And my jaw is still on the floor because it was so shocking what happened. So he starts the article by telling you that, and then you want to listen because he was there, he witnessed this happen. So he's kind of telling you to perk up and pay attention. Did you guys like that article? Yeah, well, Jamie, if you think about it, look, it was a time, definitely there are a lot of racial undertones in the writing because it was 1938 and you had an African American fighting a German. And, Adolf Hitler did not think highly of African American athletes. This is the same, 2 years before it was with Jesse Owens. That's interesting, Justin, because normally this one grabs people and the others don't. So it just goes to show you it's all about, personal preference. I have one more to share with you. It's from a little bit later. It's called The Miracle of Coogan's Bluff. And I like this one. Red Smith, yeah, you guys are all making great points. Um, so Red Smith was another writer who he actually, there's a lot of awards now given in his honor. And there's, a Red Smith Writing Award. So he was very popular. This one's from a little bit later, though. It's from 1951. And it's about the shot heard round the world. Are you guys familiar with the shot heard round the world? This is not the Revolutionary War shot heard round the world, though. This is the Giants. Yeah, exactly. So, um, I like this article, because Red Smith in trying to figure out how to tell you the story, he tells you the story. So he is just showing you kind of what are the okay. This is crazy. I saw this game. How am I going to tell you this story? I don't even know where to start. Should I start here, here, or here? So I like this as an example because it shows you the different approaches you can take and the different ways that a story can be written. Um, this article was on Deadspin recently, and they were saying, why should you know about this article? And they said, if you're a fan of sports writing the way it used to be, then you should know about this article. So listen to this one and let me know what you think. It's a little confusing, so pay attention, because you got to remember, he's trying to figure out how he wants to tell you the story. So now it's done. Now the story ends, and there's no way to tell it. The art of fiction is dead. Reality has strangled invention. Only the utterly impossible, the inexpressibly fantastic can ever be plausible again. Down on the green and white and earth brown geometry of the playing field, a drunk tries to break through the ranks of ushers, marshaled along the foul lines, to keep profane feet off the diamond. The ushers thrust him back, and he lunges at them, struggling in the clutch of 2 or 3 men. He breaks free, and 4 or 5 tackle him. He shakes them off, bursts through the line, runs head on into a special park cop, who brings him down with a flying tackle. Here comes a whole platoon of ushers. They lift the man and haul him, twisting and kicking, back across the first baseline. Again he shakes loose, and it crashes the line. He is through. He is away, weaving out towards center field, where cheering thousands are jammed beneath the windows of the Giants clubhouse. At heart, our man is a giant too. He never gave up. From center field comes burst upon burst of cheering. Pennants are waving, uplifted fists are brandished, hats are flying. Again and again, the dark clubhouse windows blaze with the light of the photographer's flashbulbs. Here comes that same drunk out of the mob, back across the green turf into the infield. Coattails flying, he runs the bases, slides into third. Nobody bothers him now. And the story remains to be told, the story of how the Giants won the 1951 pennant in the National League, the tale of their barreling run through August and September and into October, of the final day of the season when they won the championship and started home with it from Boston, to hear on the train how the dead, defeated Dodgers had risen from the ashes in the Philadelphia twilight, of the 3 games playoff in which they won and lost and were losing again with 1 out in the 9th inning yesterday when, oh, why bother? Maybe this is the way to tell it. Bobby Thompson, a young Scot from Staten Island, delivered a timely hit yesterday in the 9th inning of an enjoyable game of baseball before 34,320 witnesses in the Polo Grounds. Or perhaps this is better. Well, said Whitey Lockman, standing on second base in the 2nd inning of yesterday's playoff game between the Giants and the Dodgers. Ah, there, said Bobby Thompson, pulling into the same station after hitting a ball to left field. How've you been? Fancy, Lockman said, meeting you here. Oops, Thompson said. Sorry. And the Giants' first chance for a big inning up against Don Newcomb disappeared as they tagged Thompson out. Up in the press section, the voice of Willie Goodrich came over the amplifiers announcing a macabre statistic. Thompson has now hit safely in 15 consecutive games. Just then the floodlights were turned on, enabling the Giants to see and count their runners on each base. It wasn't funny, though, because it seemed for so long that the Giants weren't going to get another chance like the one Thompson squandered by trying to take second base with a playmate already there. They couldn't hit Newcomb, and the Dodgers couldn't do anything wrong. Sal Magley's most splendorous pitching would avail nothing unless New York could match the run Brooklyn had scored in the first inning. The story was winding up, and it wasn't the happy ending that such a tale demands. Poetic justice was a phrase without meaning. Now it was the 7th inning, and Thompson was up with runners on first and third base, none out, pitching a shutout in Philadelphia last Saturday night, pitching again in Philadelphia on Sunday, holding the Giants scoreless thus far. Newcomb had now gone 21 innings without allowing a run. He threw 4 strikes to Thompson. 2 were fouled off out of play. Then he threw a 5th. Thompson's fly scored Monty Irvin. The score was tied. It was a new ball game. Wait a moment, though. Here's Pee Wee Reese singling safely in the 8th. Here's Duke Snyder singling Reese to 3rd. Here's Magley wild pitching a run home. Here's Andy Pofko slashing a hit through Thompson for another score. Here's Billy Cox batting still another home. Where does his hit go? Where else? Through Thompson at third. So it was Dodgers ball game, 4-1, and the Dodgers pin it. So all right, better get started and beat the crowd home. That stuff in the ninth inning, that didn't mean anything. A single by Al Dark, a single by Don Mueller, Irvin's pop-up, Lockman's one-run double, now the corniest possible sort of Hollywood schmaltz stretcher bearers plodding away with an injured Mueller between them, symbolic of the Giants themselves. There went Newcomb, and here came Ralph Branca. Who's at bat? Thompson again? He beat Branca with the home run the other day. Would Charlie Dresden order him walked, putting the winning run on base to pitch to the dead-end kids at the bottom of the batting order? No, Branca's first pitch was called a strike. The second pitch, well, when Thompson reached first base, he turned and looked towards the left field stands. Then he started jumping straight up in the air again and again. Then he trotted around the bases, taking his time. Ralph Branca turned and started for the clubhouse. The number on his uniform looked huge, 13. So what do you think about that one? Jamie, why do you say that? Because you just can't, you weren't following it? Or because the words you couldn't understand? Yeah, and the reason it was all over the place is because he's trying to figure out how to tell you the story. So he's saying, okay, I just saw this, witnessed this crazy thing. How am I going to tell you this story? Do I want to tell you the story by starting with the end and telling you the Giants are celebrating and won? Or do I want to tell you by saying, flat out, Bobby Thompson, a young Scot, hit a timely hit in front of 34,320 fans at the Polo Club? Or am I going to, tell you the story by this because this was so crazy? They stole a base and their guy was already there. So maybe I'll just tell you by the conversation that they had at each other on base, oh, fancy meeting you here. How have you been? Then finally, it goes into more of telling, kind of the play-by-play of what's going on. And then you get to the bottom of the game, basically there's no way they're going to come back. And so he's saying it's Hollywood smokes. The only way they're going to win is if Hollywood wrote this story. So that's why he was all over the place, because he was trying to figure out how he wanted to tell this story. And through that exercise, he told us the story. So I like to share this example because it shows you that there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can tell the story. You don't have to start at the beginning of the story, right? You can start at the end or in the middle or with something monumental that happened. You don't have to start from the beginning and go to the end. Does anybody have any other things to say about this article? Do you think you have a good idea of the writing style from back then? Did you notice how many run-on sentences there were? Josh, when you say you couldn't follow it, meaning you didn't understand it, or it was just all, what couldn't you follow, do you think? Why do you think that? Yeah, it is a bit confusing. That's kind of why in the beginning I tell you guys to listen up for this is how he's trying to figure out how to tell you the story, because if I didn't tell you that, then you'd be really confused. But you can still see the imagery and the way he tells the story, right? Yeah, no, I wasn't joking. Yeah, he kept you on your toes, Bennett. You really had to pay attention. So if you could imagine, reading this article, this is not an article that you would read casually. You really had to focus on it to understand what he was telling you in the article. I'll tell you that the only reason I'm reading them to you is because this is, I can't just copy this book and send it out because it's copyright stuff. But also, Jamie, I think you have a good point where you say it's easier if you read it than if you hear it. But if you hear it, you're being forced to actually listen and try to picture that story in your head. So, when you're writing your newspaper article, that's one way that you can see if you're doing a good job is if you can read it to someone and they can picture it in their head, then you're on the right track. So I just wanted to give you guys some examples. If you need more examples, let me know. I can come up with some more, but hopefully that gives you a good idea of the writing style back then. Big words, they didn't use the same words that we use now. They didn't talk the same way we talk now. Crazy random analogies, lots of run-on sentences. One of those sentences was an entire paragraph. So if that gives you the indication of how wordy they were. In 1921 is when sports radio came around. This is actually coming up, going to be the 91st year of the World Series broadcast on radio. And so the World Series is really what kind of put radio on the map, along with a George Carpentier, Jack Dempsey fight. But originally, radio, you couldn't broadcast live from the facility. You had to reenact. You had to tell the story from the studio. So a lot of times you were relying on people to tell you the story, so then you could then in turn reenact the story for your listeners. And so that might have included, the crack of the bat or the roar of the crowd that you had to duplicate for them, because that technology wasn't available back then. It wasn't until later that they allowed you could broadcast from the game. The other thing about sports radio is that in the beginning, a lot of these guys who were writers were the ones who went on the radio because they kind of naturally had that ability to tell the story. And radio is the same thing. You could only listen. You didn't have any other assistance. No visuals to go along with the words. Another part of radio or of sports coverage early on that you don't maybe not think about is sports cartoons. Here's a cartoon that was published in 1904 in the San Francisco Bulletin, and the amazing thing to me is this can be published tomorrow in the New York Times, and it would still be relevant. So back then there were a lot of illustrations, and I think if you guys last week when you were looking at this SI Vault saw how many illustrations they used. We don't have these editorial type cartoons as much anymore than we did before. And so, one cartoonist would sometimes draw political events or current events or world, issues or whatever. And so the different kind of storylines could make their way into other cartoons. This was drawn by a guy named Tad Dorgan, who happened to be probably one of the most popular sports cartoonists from this time period. And Tad died early on. So we're talking late 1800s or early 1900s is when he did a majority of his work. So you can see here in this cartoon that would have been published in the paper, this is his take on boxers going in and out of retirement. So you can see the one door is going to retirement, and the guy who got the measles is saying, "I'll be right out." The guy behind him is saying, "I'm getting dizzy." The other guy says, "Let's rest a while." And then the guy who's coming out of retirement through that door says, ladies and gentlemen, I'm back and I'm in condition. So this is his a take on the revolving door of boxers going in and out of retirement, which is really interesting. That's why I think it's so interesting that it could be published today, because it's really a relevant kind of observation still to this day in boxing and other sports too. So this is, oftentimes kind of an overlooked part of early sports coverage. There is an EBSCOhost article, if you want to read it, where I got this from. It's called Sports Cartoons in Context, Tad Dorgan and Multi-Genre Cartooning in Early 20th Century Newspapers. So it talks a lot about that. Okay, so let's think about early sports writing. What are some of the challenges that these people might have faced when it came to telling the story? Yeah, they had to paint the whole picture. You couldn't follow your teams when you're out of town. Yeah. Limited resources. Yeah. How do you get the story back to your editor? How do you travel to the event? If you were in New York and you were covering a Rose Bowl, that's a long train ride. How do you tell the story? You also, there were multiple deadlines back then too. There was a morning edition and a late edition of the paper. So what deadline were you writing for? Um, so there were plenty of challenges back then. You couldn't go sit in the press box and watch the highlights if you missed something. You had to actually pay attention and follow the game and see what was going on, because if you missed it, guess what? You couldn't write about it. So yeah, you guys came up with some good challenges. So what do you guys think comes next? Here we've looked. Yeah, they couldn't get interviews. Although back then, Bennett, that brings up a good point. As these guys were friends with these athletes, like on terms that you wouldn't necessarily find today. For instance, Grantland Rice and Babe Ruth were friends for over 30 years. So it's interesting to me the relationship that they had. But you also, had to keep in mind that whatever the writers were writing about you was how people saw you. So you didn't really have a choice. You had to make sure that writer represented you in a light that you wanted to be remembered for. Okay, so all week we've talked, or all month long, we've talked about the evolution of sports media and how it's changed over time. And now that we're talking early sports coverage, this is when we just had words, and then we added pictures, and then we added words and moving pictures, and then we added color pictures, and now we have access to everything every time. So I'm just curious, what do you guys think comes next? Yeah, that's a great point, Jamie. Athletes weren't the celebrities that they are today. I mean, some of them were, but it was very not. It was very rare. I can tell you the big thing right now is how to television. How so, Justin? Oh yeah, you're right. You did. I'm sorry, I wasn't clear enough. Now that we've discussed everything, from where we are at this point, what comes next. Jamie, exactly right. Like, you guys are the ones who are going to be coming up with this stuff. It's stuff that you are going to start thinking about. I know one big thing that they're struggling with is, how to keep your eyes on the television instead of down on your mobile device or your computer or your tablet while you're watching the game. So they're really working on interactive television to keep your eyes on the TV. I always said I'd like to have holograms. That'd be awesome, wouldn't it? Kind of like the Tupac hologram. Robot boxing, I like that idea. Okay, so let's talk about the assignment this week. It's one assignment, but a couple of different components. Yeah, Jamie, that's exactly what ESPN's working on. Kind of like if you're watching a game with Carolina and the Giants, that's who plays tonight, you can pick and choose, and you can have tweets about those two teams on your screen. And then if you were to change the channel and switch to the Packers and the Bears, then you could change what information you have on your television screen at the same time. Pretty remarkable stuff. So okay, so let's talk about the assignment. The main part of the assignment is not just the article, but also you're going to take that article, the subject of the article, and then bring it up to present day time. So it's a lot of speculation in this assignment. But I want you to demonstrate that you understand kind of what we've talked about this month. So what you're going to do is you're going to write a newspaper article emulating the writing style from the list. There is a list, so make sure you download the assignment. Then you're going to create the media coverage for the story as if it took place today. Think about what would happen if we were in that media anytime, anywhere stage when this event happened. So you're going to write a blog post, you're going to do a feature story, and then you're going to do a fake Twitter feed. And when I say fake Twitter feed, you don't actually have to create a Twitter feed. You're just going to write it up. And I want to see engagement. How would Lou Armstrong, how would Lou Gehrig interact with fans on Twitter after his retirement speech if it had happened today? That kind of thing. Do you guys have any questions about that? Okay. Like I said, I'll be out of town, but I will be working tomorrow. So if you have any questions, please reach out to me. Josh, no, I would prefer you choose something from the list unless you want to email me offline and give me your, what you're thinking of, and I can let you know. Jamie, you're not actually using Twitter. You're just engaging. You're creating a fake list. So you're doing fake tweets and engaging with the story. Looking at it how it would be covered today on Twitter. The idea is, I hope that in the first week you guys have you established a Twitter account, and hopefully you've been kind of checking it out over the last month and using it, for different information and assignments and stuff. So hopefully you're a little bit familiar with it, more familiar than you were before. Yeah, that's right, Justin. Like, or at Lucky Lou, the Yankees fans' response today was overwhelming. I still am one of the luckiest men alive. That kind of thing. Jamie, you don't have to use hashtags, but I would do some Googling, check it out. But you don't have to use hashtag. But hashtagging, it can be, it's all how the person uses it. So it's really this whole assignment, besides, the actual facts of the story, is all speculation. Yeah, and each person uses hashtags differently. So it's not a requirement that of the assignment. Does anybody have any other questions? All right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn the recording off. Please reach out to me if you have any questions. Don't forget that your response discussion post is due by Sunday. Um, you don't have to put this stuff on your blog. You can just submit it through the platform if you want. So yeah, I'll be around if you guys have any questions. The assignment is due Monday. And please, also, if you have the opportunity, make sure you fill out the evaluation form for the course. Your feedback is very important to us, and we are interested in hearing how your time at Full Sail is going to this point. So please share your thoughts and opinions with us there. But I am looking forward to each of your assignments and seeing what you've learned over the course of the month. And I'm also looking forward to following you guys as you progress through the program. So I hope you have enjoyed the class, and hopefully I will see you again soon.